Welcome to the Pursuing Points podcast, where it's all about the pursuit of credit card points and miles today so that you can travel the world free of charge tomorrow. And now, your host, Peter Foti.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 9th Pursuing Points podcast. I'm your host, as always, Peter Foti. I realize it's been a few weeks since the last episode, but hopefully we can get back to a little bit of a regular cadence here. I do have some pretty special guests lined up. Just trying to work out some scheduling conflicts, but some websites that you may be reading currently, their editors and writers, whatnot, have some of them coming on. So pretty excited about that. But this episode today, I do not have a co-host. Rather, I will be doing this by myself. And today's episode is somewhat interesting in that it was inspired by my first ever iTunes review. Now, when I started this podcast, I didn't necessarily think that people would listen. Certainly, I felt like I had a certain amount of information I could provide. And really, I just was doing this because this is something that interests me. And it's something I talk often about. And so a podcast seemed like a good place to sort of direct those thoughts. But to date, people are listening, and in receiving my first iTunes review, I was pretty excited because that means someone's listening. And the review said, I'm going to read it actually. I wish there was more info geared towards different credit ranges. I happened on this podcast because I was looking for advice on balance transfers. The host, Peter, is knowledgeable, thank you, with a voice tone that is soothing. Also, he swallows a lot. So I apologize for that. I'll try and fix the swallowing. I can't relate to a lot of the feedback because my score isn't in the 800s, but there's still some great tips. So what I really want to do today, actually, is talk a little bit about how to improve a poor credit score, as well as some of your options in terms of unsecured credit cards and obviously like secured cards, but for bad credit specifically. Obviously, the cards that I tend to talk about on the show are, things like the Sapphire Preferred and the Sapphire Reserve and the Amex Platinum. Obviously, I realize that those aren't options for everybody. And from a podcast perspective, those are the types of things I will continue to talk about simply because that's what I know the most about. But I have helped people in the past, friends of mine who maybe didn't have stellar credit, get started in this space, and some of them even with secured credit cards. So I do have some knowledge of it. I don't expect to talk about it all the time. I would love to get some guests on perhaps from websites that sort of specialize in this sort of thing. But for now, I just want to sort of give my thoughts on how you might go about improving your credit score and then talk about a few secured credit card options, and then we'll see where that leaves us. So with your credit score and sign up for credit cards, it's kind of a catch-22, right? You need credit to get credit, but to build credit, you need to have had credit, right? So it's kind of hard to have one without the other. So how do people do this? Well, one of the ways is when you're younger, whenever you have the opportunity, if you can sign up for a credit card and have someone co-sign for you, that's the way that I started. I realize not everyone's going to have that opportunity, but if you can and you're younger and you're just getting started and you really don't have much of a credit profile, that's a great way to get started, is to go into a bank with a parental guardian, whomever it may be, and try to sign up for a card and have them co-sign. So in my case, credit score was something like $200 or $400, and the card was used sparingly, small purchases, and paid off in full every month. And that's what sort of allowed me to build credit from a young age. If you're getting started later, that's okay as well. When we talk about secured credit cards and things like that, I think that'll resonate, and maybe that'll be an option for you. But before we can talk about improving your credit score, I do want to talk a little bit about your credit score in general and like how it's made up, some of the factors that go into it, etc. Because you really have to understand how it works before you can understand how to improve it. And I'm really just going to give a high-level overview here. I've written several posts myself. Obviously, there's tons of information online about credit scores and how they are calculated, et cetera. So I'm going to provide several links in the show notes, some to my website, some to other websites, just about credit scores, how they're calculated, how they can be improved, et cetera. So if you're looking for a deeper dive, I would check in one of those. But for the sake of this podcast, what we need to understand is that 30% of your credit score is made up by your payment history, right? So this is basically, do you pay your bills on time? And if you do, this part of your credit score is going to be fine. So that's really the most important thing, is pay your bills on time. And obviously, there may be situations where, life happens and you're unable to do that, but just, work towards getting on track as fast as you can, right? Your spending has to coincide with what you're able to pay, so that you're able to pay in full every month. Next is amounts owed, and this also represents 30%. So when we talk about amounts owed, we typically talk about it in the terms of credit utilization. So what this is all of the credit that you've got available to you divided by all of the money that you owe. So let's say that you've got $1,000 in available credit and you owe $100. That means that your revolving credit utilization is at 10%. 10% is a good number. Generally, you want to try and stay below that if you can. Obviously, if you have 10,000 and you owe 500, now you're at 50%. So, because really what banks want to do is they want to give you credit cards, but they don't necessarily, they don't want to give you credit because they think that you really need the money, right? So when they see that you've got all of this credit available to you and you're using very little of it, they're going to feel comfortable lending to you, generally speaking, because they know that you're not seeking out additional credit because you don't have any money and yet you need to pay for things. You see what I'm saying? So trying to keep that number below 10%, obviously paying your bills on time and in full is going to help you with that, but also, again, spending in line with what you're able to pay. 15% of your credit score is made up by your length of history. This is simply the average of all of your accounts. So if you're very new, obviously that number is going to be pretty low. And even mine, when I check my credit score, I still get like a D or an F for this because I think my average age is something like 3 or 4 years. And that's just simply because even though I do have the card from when I was younger, obviously I've got cards that I've signed up for in the last 12 to 18 months, and that's pulling down the average. So if you're just getting started, or if your credit score isn't that great, try to focus on this. So if you've already got credit cards and you've got maybe poor credit, stick with that. Use that for purchases. Pay it off in full every month. And over time, as that card sort of matures, your length of history will increase. And if you're new, you probably shouldn't be signing up for too many cards, right? You really just want to pick one, spend some money on it, stick with it, and over time, you'll be able to see the effects on your score. 10% is new credit. So this is like hard inquiries. I talked on the blog about soft versus hard inquiries. Basically, the TLDR is that a soft inquiry is something that it's when your credit report is being pulled, but you're not asking for a loan. Right. So this is if a credit card company is going to pre-approve you for a credit offer, they're going to use a soft inquiry. And then if you go ahead and apply for that card, it's going to be a hard inquiry because at that point you're actually applying for credit. And creditors use this so that they can see how often are you asking for money, right? Generally, those tend to fall off within 4 or 24 months or so. But just keep an eye on that. Again, if you're new or if you've got bad credit, you want to keep this number as low as possible. Ideally, you want to just do it once, allow that hard inquiry to fall off, and then you'll have your card that you're using and paying, etc. And then finally, 10% is types of credit used. And this is simply, do you have credit cards, mortgages, car loans, student loans, etc. Right? So all of those things sort of coupled together. And really, banks just want to see diversity. I mainly have credit cards, so I'm not super diverse in this respect, but it is, it's only 10% of your score. So that's sort of a high level overview. Payment history, amounts owed, length of history, new credit, and types of credit. So again, I will link to some articles that sort of dive a little bit deeper into these. And if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to reach out via email. One of the things I was going to mention at the beginning is that not only did I receive that iTunes review, but I've also been receiving emails full of questions and comments, which are great. And to date, I've answered every email. So if you do have a question, just let me know. But anyway, that was sort of a tangent. Sorry. So now that we understand a little bit how your credit score is derived, we should talk a little bit about some ways in which you could improve it. Now, a lot of these are going to sound like common sense, and that's because they are. And, for pretty much all of these, it's going to be much easier said than done for most people. And I totally understand that. Obviously, everyone's situation is different. These are simply, at a high level, some basic things that we can all be doing to ensure our credit score is improving, or at least staying the same if it's already, above, say, 700 or so. So take it for what it's worth, but certainly these would be good starting steps. And again, there's only 5 here, but Credit Karma has a great list that I'll link to in the show notes. I found a few other really good lists, some of which I'll link to. So I would encourage you to read them. And, the biggest thing they have to understand is that this is a marathon and it's not a sprint, right? You have to have credit, use credit, and then pay off your credit card bills. And really, over time, that's how you get a better credit score. If you can avoid delinquencies and late payments and things like that, that's going to help you a great deal. And again, I'm generalizing, but that is the goal, right? So the first tip, of course, is simply to pay off any existing balances rather than moving them around if you can. So we talked about 30% of your score is amounts owed. Well, if your credit utilization currently is, say, 50%, because at one point in time you had really good credit, you signed up for a bunch of cards, and then you spent some money, maybe it was frivolous spending or what have you, maybe it was just a life emergency. In any case, the best thing that you can do is to pay off those balances. And certainly, moving them around and taking advantage of a balance transfer with, say, no APR for 18 months or something like that, those are good offers. And if you think you can pay it off within 18 months, I'm not necessarily discouraging you from doing what you think is best for you and your family. The point is very simply, if you have the capabilities, it's always better to be paying off your existing balances. So, some people get to the point where they get a pair of scissors and chop up their cards and they don't request new ones until the balances are paid off. If that's what you feel like you need to do, then that's what you should do. But at the end of the day, decreasing your credit utilization is one of the best ways to increase your credit score. So if you have balances, do your best to pay them off. Next would be check your credit score for errors. Now, I think that this gets overblown a little bit. Most credit reports probably don't have errors on them, but certainly some do. So it's important that you check your credit score, and if you see something on there that just doesn't quite look right, maybe it's something as bad as a whole new account that you don't recognize, but it could be something as small as maybe they say you missed a payment, something like that, right? Just something where it to be an error. The best thing you can do is look at your credit score, see if anything looks out of place, and then give the credit scoring agencies a call. So there are 3 of them: Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. They all operate a little bit differently in terms of how they calculate your score. But if you find an error, they would be the ones to call. I will link to their websites in the show notes, and and you're also allowed to get 1 free credit score per year. So websites like Credit Karma and Credit Sesame, even though they're free credit scores, they're not necessarily your official credit report. But you can request 1 official credit report that has all 3 scores once per year. And the name of that website, I think, is freeannualcreditreport.com. I'll double check that and put it in the show notes. But request your official credit report from that website. See if it has any errors, and if it does, do your best to get them taken off. Next, of course, make your bill payments on time. So we already talked about that with payment history. 30% of your score is your payment history. So if you're making your payments on time, you're already a third of the way towards ensuring that you're going to have a good score. Don't close accounts thinking that it's going to improve your score in the short term. I have talked about closing accounts on the show before. I close accounts, and there's not necessarily something explicitly wrong about closing accounts, but you do need to understand how it's going to affect your score. So especially if your score is lower and it's, we want to handle it with a little bit more care, canceling a card could have a bigger impact, because if your score is lower, that probably means you have fewer accounts, which means you have fewer, you have less money available to you. And so let's say that right now you've got 2 cards and each has a $500 limit. You go ahead and you owe, say, $100, right? So you owe 100 out of 1,000, that's 10%. If you close one of those cards, now your revolving credit goes from 10% all the way up, it doubles to 20%, right? Because now you've got $500 available to you and you still owe $100. So 100 into $500 is now 20%. So keep that in mind, right? If you don't have that much money available to you right now, you should just tread carefully when it comes to considering closing an account. And really, I would assume that in most cases, if you have cards geared towards a lower credit score, they probably don't have an annual fee. So there's really no reason to cancel them. Keep them open. It'll help your length of credit history. And then, of course, just pay down the balances as best you can. And, the last thing is sort of just, try not to obsess about it. It does take time for all this to happen. You just, like I said before, you need to have credit, you need to use credit, and then you need to pay it off. It will take time for your scores to be reflective of your responsible credit use. So don't get discouraged if it doesn't happen right away. And, try not to be obsessive about it in the sense that, your credit score is important, but, you really only need to be ultra focused on it when you know that you're going to need it. Most of the stuff that we talk about in here is from a credit card perspective is, it's not necessarily frivolous, but it's certainly not as, it's not like you're buying a house or a car or, something like that, right? I mean, we're trying to get the most value for our money, which I think is important, but it shouldn't be the thing that necessarily keeps you up at night. As long as you know that you've got credit, you're using it responsibly, and you're paying your bills, everything else will just sort of come along with it. So with all that being said, if you do have a lower credit score, you do have options. And frankly, because I don't follow this very often, I was super surprised to find that you can actually earn cash back with some of these cards, which is pretty interesting. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a secured credit card. So these are the types of cards that I've recommended to my friends in the past who have maybe, they had credit when they were younger and then they made some mistakes and now they're trying to rebuild. I think it's great for something like that. And it also might be great if you're younger. Just if you're getting started out, you don't have much of a history, and you can't necessarily find someone to co-sign for you, a secured credit card is a great way to sort of get started. Basically, what a secured credit card is, it uses money that you place into a security deposit account as collateral as your credit limit. So let's say that you have $200 and you want to open a secured credit card account. You can take that to the bank and give them the $200, and they will give you a credit card with a credit line equal to $200, right? So you have to have the money in order to spend it. But what this allows to do is the banks, it eliminates all the risk for them because it's your $200, right? So even though it's credit and it gets reported as such, it's still your money. So there is a great website called The Simple Dollar that actually goes through and breaks down the best credit cards for bad credit, which I will link to in the show notes because I found it to be super informative myself, and I'm sure you will as well. I just pulled out a few random cards from that list that looked pretty interesting to me. So the first one was the Discover It Secured Card. Now, the incredible thing about this, and what I was saying before, is that this card actually earns cash back, which frankly I didn't even know was possible with these secured credit cards. So basically with this card, once you're approved, the minimum security deposit is $200, right? So you can put more than that, but that's the minimum to open the account. You have to have $200. And then At 12 months, they start doing monthly reviews and they see, are you eligible for us to give you that $200 back? And we'll basically turn this into an unsecured credit card, right? So an unsecured card, that's just your typical card. It's not backed up by any of your own collateral or anything like that. It's just the bank is saying, here's $200 worth of credit. You can spend it. You have to just pay us back. Excuse me. So at 12 months, they'll start to do that. There is no annual fee. And then you earn 2% cash back at restaurants and gas stations on up to $1,000 in combined purchases per quarter. I think that's pretty incredible. And you earn 1% cash back on all of the purchases, which, for a secured credit card with no annual fee, that would be a great way to get started. Not only can you get started building your credit, but you can also get started with this whole, points and cashback world that we operate in. Finally, so it reports to all three of the major credit bureaus, which, like I said, those are Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. So you can use this card to build and rebuild your credit so long as you're being responsible about it. They will give you your FICO credit score for free in your monthly statement, which is fantastic. You can sort of track your progress. And overall, it seems like a good card. Obviously, Discover is a good company. They've got great customer service. I myself have a Discover 8 card, even though I'm considering canceling it. But nonetheless, in the time that I've had it, it's been a good experience for me. So that's one of your secured credit card options. And then the second one that I just sort of pulled off this list, because this specific card, this is the specific card that I referred to a friend of mine not too long ago. So this is the Capital One Secured MasterCard. Now, this one does not have an annual fee, but it also does not earn any cash back. Frankly, I was under the impression that that none of these cards would offer cash back. I'm not sure how new that Discover It card is, but I think it's certainly, I don't want to call it necessarily an anomaly, but I think that that's pretty interesting of an offer. So anyway, the Capital One Secured card, in much the same way as the Discover It regularly reports to the three major credit bureaus. You get your credit score for free every month. There's no annual fee. You can give them up to $3,000 towards your credit line. It's a MasterCard. So it's just like any other card. This is another great option for you. And again, this card is linked from the Simple Dollar blog post that I'm going to link in the show notes. So this would be a great card to take a look at. The Discover It card would be a great card to take a look at. From a secured credit card perspective. And then from an unsecured perspective, if your score is maybe a little bit better, you've got some great options there. And again, some of these actually provide cash back, which I was surprised. I'm not going to go through a long list of these, but the one that sort of jumped out to me the most that was on the top of the list is the Capital One Unsecured Visa. And they've got a pre-qualification, takes less than 60 seconds. And as we talked about before, looking at that pre-qualification is not going to ding your credit report since it'll use a soft inquiry. So that's good. It's a fully functioning unsecured card. You don't have to give them any money to sign up, and it earns 1% cash back on gas and groceries. So you do have options if your score is not great, or if you're new, or if you're young, right? There are options for you. So I would definitely encourage you to look at this list, see what might work for you. And obviously, there is sort of a gap here, right? So there's a gap between some of the cards we're talking about right now and then the Amex Platinum Sapphire Reserve. There is somewhat of a middle ground there. There's no annual fee cards that require a little bit better of a credit score, but not maybe quite as high as like a Sapphire Reserve. And we'll talk about those because obviously that's part of a good strategy is having the right products for your spend. And it just so happens that right now, based on my goals and spending, I don't use as many of those cards, but it's certainly not to say that they're not beneficial, depending on what your goals and spending habits are. So with that, we've talked about how your credit score is derived, some of the ways you can improve it, some of the cards you can get if it's not great or if you're new. And so as always, like I said before, I just want to reiterate, if you do have questions, go to pursuingpoints.com, click on the contact section and just let me know. Happy to help as best I can. And also, if you have suggestions or requests for some of the things you might like to hear me talk about, I'm also open to that. I do have some shows scheduled. I do want to talk about my 2017 wallet and what that might look like, given some of my new travel plans, etc. Like I said, I do have some pretty cool guests lined up. And so I'm really excited about the content that we've got coming out soon. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.